Good evening, nationalists. This is the hopeful final in a series of videos that we've been making on the disgraceful attack upon Australia First by the so-called Party for Freedom. One of the attacks that they made was that they made this remarkable allegation that Australia First was in some manner or other sympathetic to the objectives of Islamism. The video that they critiqued was really a video about some guys affected by the grog and discussing Colonel Gaddafi, the deceased former Libyan leader who was murdered by Islamists in 2011. Richard Heinberg, a prominent journalist and historian, commented a few years ago that ahead of all other world leaders, it was Colonel Gaddafi who first raised the attention of the world as to the importance of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden had attempted to kill Gaddafi, and as late as 1996, Britain's intelligence service MI6 was colluding with Al-Qaeda to murder Gaddafi. So, this odd circumstance, the Party for Freedom wants to criticise Australia First or me or somebody else over having a discussion as to the upside of the former Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. So what's it really all about? What's the whole thing all about? It seems to me that the smear was constructed for a reason. Australia's patriot movement, as it describes itself, must be allowed to remain only a movement concerned with the issue of Islam, say its leaders, by their practice, rather than a movement that takes into account the broader question of immigration. When this patriot movement is concerned only with the question of Islam, it usually means that they view Australia's meaningless wars in the Middle East as positive things, and they believe that the Zionist state, the Israeli state, is in some manner their friend in combating international Islamism. And by pushing these two issues, it remains effectively a satellite of the Liberal Party. So what we're suggesting is that if it remains at that level, the anti-Islamist movement, or this patriot movement in Australia, becomes an effective block against a deeper nationalist mobilisation. Now, this is all difficult political stuff, but we're actually dealing with people operating to a very clever agenda, and you'll be able to understand it once I flip the matter over and discuss the alternative. If the patriot movement, as it describes itself, became anti-immigration in general and not simply anti-Islam, in other words, it gives away the idea that diversity minus Islam is a good thing, where in point of fact diversity minus Islam is still diversity, as we put it. By being an anti-immigration movement, it would actually challenge the politics of the Australian elite. If it looked at the Middle East in a new way and started to see the dynamics of Middle East politics, it might also challenge the foreign policy decisions of the Australian elite. And if it did those two things, any block towards a deeper consciousness along the road to nationalism would indeed be there. Hence the leaders of many of these patriot groups, particularly groups like the Party of Freedom and many of the leaders of Reclaim, want this people's awareness movement about Islam restrained. Let's come back to the issue a moment of Colonel Gaddafi. This video actually said that I personally, and Australia First, were in some manner or other sympathetic to a Muslim terrorist. Now, Gaddafi obviously was a Muslim, obviously, and at certain points in his career he had indeed been linked to political violence and terror. But Gaddafi, in the last phase of his career, began to change. Gaddafi warned the West in no uncertain terms that any attempt to destabilise his government would, quote, turn Europe black. And he meant that as a quip, but it was a fact. Gaddafi closed the Mediterranean ports against so-called asylum seekers. So what did the West do? The West overthrew Colonel Gaddafi, created a failed state where ISIS and other terrorists run amok, and of course Europe faces a refugee flood across the Mediterranean. But the West didn't only intervene against Gaddafi. Several years before, our side, our Australian side, overthrew Saddam Hussein. Now, he's not a particularly nice man, but the overthrow of Saddam Hussein has created havens in Iraq for ISIS and other terrorists. And right now, Australia has supported the attempt to overthrow the Assad government in Syria, creating the massive refugee crisis that we've recently seen, the bringing of thousands of people to Australia who are alien here, and creating conditions whereby ISIS and other terrorist movements can thrive. I have to ask myself, why would these so-called patriots be cross at Australia first for pointing this sort of thing out? I would have thought that highlighting the failure of Australian politics in the Middle East would be a good thing, but apparently not. The patriots, as they say they are people who don't want these truths to become known. In other words, they wish to treat the patriot-type people as fools. Former American President Abraham Lincoln gave us that immortal quote that you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. It seems to me that this patriot movement should, at the Reclaim rallies in a couple of weeks' time, be in fact marching on American consulates and the American embassy to condemn the Western policy in the Middle East that is creating terrorism, and to condemn the Australian government for fostering conditions that lead to it. But no, they won't be doing that. They simply prefer to make some rather obvious points about the downside of Islam in Australia. The Australia First Party wants the patriot movement to deepen, and we want it to lead itself into an anti-immigration movement which challenges the positions of the Australian state. Is that why the Party for Freedom condemned us? Thank you.